Welcome back. This is GrandTuhon Aditya from LightHaven. Today I'm going to be giving you my opinions on pivoting the legs specifically for the Filipino martial arts. Let's just quickly talk about the different uses of pivoting. And now again, I'm going to keep saying this again and again and again and again because I'm sure there are enough people who are going to disagree with me on what I say over here. This is what I have found through my research, through my training, through my study. If you guys have a different conclusion, if you've come to a different conclusion or I missed something out, please do feel free to let me know down below. So when we're talking about pivoting, again, in my opinion, there are two reasons why you may pivot in martial arts, and this is across the spectrum. This is empty hands and weapon-based martial arts. First is when I want to use the pivot to essentially push off the ground, and that's going to add power to a strike. This is something that you generally see in empty hand striking arts, right? So let's say I'm throwing a cross. What I'm looking to do is I'm looking to push off the ground, and that leads to the pivot, that leads to the hip turn, that leads to the shoulder extension, that leads to the full range of motion in my punch. So you often hear this saying in the martial arts, and I heard it a lot when I was much younger, which is that when we punch, we take energy from the ground, and the energy travels through my ankle, through my knee, through my hip, through my shoulder, through my elbow, into my fist, and then into the opponent, and it was called kinetic linking. Now, conceptually, it made sense to me, but if you actually sat down and thought about what it means practically, it's very hard to pin down what this actually means. It just sounds really cool, but what does it actually mean? And it took me a very long time to figure it out, that it's not just some arbit turning of the heel, it's not just some arbit pivoting of the heel. I am actually pushing off the ground, and that is the energy that's then being transferred through my ankle, through my knee, through my hip, shoulder, elbow, wrist, into the fist, into my opponent. I'm pushing off the ground, and that's what ends up adding power to my strike. Similarly with the cross, I'm pushing the hook, I'm pushing off the ground, and that's what's going to turn my hip, that's what's going to add power into my hook, and that saves me from having a big wind up and a big telegraph punch. I'm pushing off the ground, pivoting, and then ending with a strike. The second reason why I may pivot is to add range of motion. Now, the range of motion might help me to, in the weapon arts, might help me to cut through a target, or it might help me, generally the range of motion is a hip range of motion type thing. So what that means is, let's say that I am throwing a roundhouse, I'm going to pivot on this bottom leg because that's going to allow me to get my hip more involved with the kick, which is going to allow me to add more power and more penetration into that kick. So if I don't pivot the leg and I just kick like this, my hip can still be involved, but it will always be to a lesser degree than if I pivot on the bottom leg, and now my hip can be involved a lot more, and I can add a lot more power to the kick. You can add maybe a third one where I need to flank my opponent, so I'm stepping in, pivoting so I can face them, or step and pivot so I can face them. But generally when we're talking about pivoting, or at least in the context I'm talking about pivoting right now, it's in the first two, where I'm going to either get more power or I'm going to get either more range of motion through the pivot. Now let's bring this into the context of the Filipino martial arts. Now I'm going to specify, I'm going to get even more specific and say I am specifically talking about weapons that I can hold with one hand. As soon as you have two-handed weapons, then there are some instances where maybe you would need a little bit of pivot to activate that hip a little bit more. It is possible. However, for the sake of this discussion, we're going to stick to weapons I can hold with one hand, whether it be a sword, a machete-like sword like this, or a knife. We're going to stick to that. Now, these same arguments are used when it comes to these kind of weapons, where I should pivot so that I can engage my entire body, and that's going to give me more power / more range of motion, which will also eventually lead to more power. It's this argument that I am sort of against, specifically when it comes to, again, single-handed weapons in the Filipino martial arts. Let's start a discussion with the knife. The simple answer is no. Please do not pivot when you have the knife. At the end of the day, everything that we're looking for is efficiency, and especially when it comes to the knife, you are working at such a close range that every single time that you pivot, it takes you time to recover, and at that close range, I don't have time to recover. The knife is a weapon of small movements, small thrusts and small slashes. I do not need to add bigger movements to it with the pivot. This is an edge. An edge doesn't necessarily need the same idea of power as a hook or a punch does. I need to get the edge on target as often as I can in as many, in as important targets as possible as I can, as quickly as I can, right? I don't need big pivoting motions for this. So with a knife, please, it doesn't make sense to pivot. With a longer weapon is now where things start to get a bit interesting. Now I'm also going to say that again, these are my observations, this is from my study, and I'm going to speak specifically for my art of Pikiri to Shakali, and the way that it has been taught to me by GrandTuhon. Very often, very specifically in the beginning, when I used to watch a lot of people pivot, and I used to pivot as well, and he's very specifically many times has told me that we do not pivot in Pikiri to Shakali. Now there could be a couple of reasons for this. The first is that when we're talking about pivoting to add power, right, this idea comes from boxing, where I'm looking to pivot to add power. However, just because it works in boxing in that context doesn't mean that it's going to work in a weapon context, because when I'm boxing or when I'm punching, especially like a jab cross, let's take a simple jab cross, I am punching, this is the line in which I am attacking, right? If I am doing an uppercut, that's the line of my force, that's the direction of my energy, from down to up or straight. Even this is in this horizontal plane. These are attacks in this sort of horizontal plane or in this rising plane. Very rarely do you see attacks in this dropping plane where an attack is going from high to low. It's really rare. Maybe you might have like a big overhand like that, but the shoulder position in that is a little bit different from when you're going to be cutting. When I am doing basic diagonal strikes over here, pushing off the ground isn't going to add any power to my strike. If I'm pushing off the ground for a cross, that makes sense. But if I'm pushing off the ground for a cut, that's not going to add any power. In fact, the cut is not going in a horizontal fashion, it's not going in a rising fashion. I'm actually dropping the weapon from high down low, and so there's no reason for me to push. In fact, I oftentimes have to do the opposite, which is I need some amount of hip turn and I need some amount of sink, because I want to put as much of my body mass behind the edge of the weapon as I can. So instead of pushing off the ground, I'm going to turn my hip and I'm going to sink, and this is what's going to add more power and more mass behind the weapon. If I am doing rising attacks, then sure, it could make sense for me to be pushing off the ground for an angle 4 like this or an angle 3 like this. That would make sense. I can even say that if I was doing a horizontal attack, even in that to some degree it might make sense to push off the ground. But for my basic diagonal strikes, it makes zero sense to pivot the foot. It doesn't add anything. In fact, it does the opposite, where it might actually increase the time taken before I can attack again. If I do extremes of pivot, I'm moving much more than I need to. I have too much time when my weapon is not on the target. I need to be able to hit and come back and hit again. Every time I pivot, it takes me longer to come back, get my weapon back on target. So in a lot of cases, the pivot is going to slow you down. Now let's examine the second part, which is range of motion. Now when we're talking about range of motion, it's important to understand or specify what is the part of our body that we're looking for increased range of motion. And generally with the pivot, it's your hips, right? So similar how I demonstrated, in empty hand martial arts, you're looking for greater range of motion within the hips. Oftentimes within the Filipino martial arts as well, you will see this is how pivoting is used, or you will see a more extreme stylized version of this where you're sinking, and this is sort of where the way that is shown. Now if I'm talking about range of motion in my hips, I need to cut, let's take simple angle 1, angle 2 or your top 2 diagonals for example. I am looking, the way I teach it, the way I like to do it is I'm looking to cut from 1 o'clock to 7 o'clock, 11 o'clock to 5 o'clock. Without turning my hips at all, I'm not turning my hips at all, I can hit these 2 angles perfectly fine. Where my hips need to start coming in is in 2 places. A, to add more power to the movement. B, for me to have a better follow through, so I can cut through something, and follow through of course equates to more power, right? I want to be able to cut through something and not get stuck on it. So in my follow through, so I've established I don't need hip turn to go from 1 to 7 or 11 to 5. What the hip turn does help me with is, again, generating power and follow through. I don't need more than this. I have 0 pivot right now. I do not need any more pivot or any more hip turn than this. It's not going to add more power. It's not going to add, I don't need the extra range of motion. I don't need to be able to turn all the way like this. At this point, giving my back, and it's not adding to the strike, it's not adding to my ability to fight, it's taking away from it, in fact, because it means I take longer to recover from here. So there is no reason I need for me to have that extra range of motion. There's one more argument which is given, which is I want my entire body behind the strike, and this is where you see oftentimes the more stylized, deeper stance where you have this kind of motion. And the logic again is I want to put more of my body behind the strike. However, once again, my body is perfectly behind the strike right now. I have a sink that's going to allow me to keep the weapon on target, control the weapon. I have hip turn. There are different ways of me making the most of that hip turn. There's things I can do with my shoulder, with my grip. They're all lending itself to adding more power. This is just going to look cool, look dramatic, but when I'm fighting, if you actually ever see a stick fight, full contact stick fight, very rarely will you see a full turn like this. Very rare. If you actually watch fighting, very rarely do you see full pivots. You might see small pivots based on movement, right? And based on inches, you might see small pivots, but you never see this in fighting because it's simply inefficient. It takes too long and it's not adding anything. I can strike perfectly powerful with this without a pivot, with a slight sink and hip turn without the pivot. Now let's talk about some of the exceptions, because there are some exceptions. Some of the exceptions might be straight movements, like I said in Balintavak, right? So if I'm going straight like this in this motion, I might benefit from having a pivot. Or if I am bracing and I'm striking here, or if I'm bracing and striking with the punyo, I might benefit by some of the pivot, by some pivot on the back leg. I might benefit on these reverse diagonals, whether thrust or slash, by adding some pivot and some push off the ground. When it comes to Wittig, I might benefit by pivoting on either leg, this leg in a side step or this leg. I can generate more power in the Wittig or in the Abaniko using a pivot. But apart from these few instances, for majority of our slashes and thrusts, the pivot, especially at long range, the pivot doesn't really add anything. It's inefficient. Now, just to end this on a slightly better note, I'm not saying don't pivot. I'm saying that make sure that even when, because there'll be times when I'll be flowing, when I will pivot a little bit, but the aim is to get your weapon back on target or facing your opponent as quickly as possible. So this is never a good option. If you do want to pivot for whatever reason, you do want to pivot, make sure that you're focusing on, I pivoted here, make sure you're focusing on getting your weapon back on target as quickly as possible, rather than exaggerating the pivot just to feel cool or stylized. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, if you learned from what you saw, please do like and share this video. If you have anything to add to the discussion, leave that in the comments down below. Please do subscribe to the channel. All of these things really do help out the school and the channel a lot. A huge thank you to all of our patrons. Thank you so much for your support. If you'd like to know more about our Patreon page and the exclusive content that we offer there, check out the link in the description down below. Lastly, our online classes are up and running. Our residential program is up and running. So to train with us from wherever you are in the world or come here and go and train with us, check out the email address I'm going to leave in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.